Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we see that there are a few updates due to the late updates from multiple sources. The only source updating so far has been Deep State Map with a update from yesterday where there are some few territorial changes that I missed in my own update. Besides that, there's some footage of fighting in the direction of Sucha, where Russian FPV drones hit a counter-attacking Ukrainian tank, trying to push the Russian forces out of a settlement southeast of Sucha. Starting out in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have entered Zelene from the eastern direction following the capture of the fortified areas northeast of the settlement, and with this the Russians are now fighting within the settlement from the eastern and western directions following the capture of the Desertion and the Shenske. To the west, the Russians have captured the remaining parts of Novovasylivka, the residential area, leaving only the farm area and the western outskirts under Ukrainian control. With this, Russians have advanced further within Novovasylivka. The Russians are here attempting to push onwards towards Uspenivka and onwards along the Solone River, with the pushing from the north within the settlement of Solone and in the south and within the settlement of Novovasylivka. At the same time, the Russians are pushing further north of Vovkove towards the main highway. The Russians are only one singular forest line from the main highway between Pokrovsk in the east and the city of Zaporizhzhia in the west. This is the main highway connection between the two cities. Following that, there's the main highway to the northwest through the city of Pavlorad and onwards to the city of Dnipro. So this is the northern road towards Dnipro in and out of Pokrovsk, and then there's the southern road through the central parts where it either has to go down south, then onwards to Zaporizhzhia, or up north towards Dnipro. Both of these are connection between Pokrovsk and two cities of Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia. The Russians are looking to cut off the first road here, the southern direction, leaving only the one road towards Dnipro. Following that, the Russians would cut off that road as well, leaving only this road in the northern direction of Pokrovsk, which goes onwards towards a wide range towards Kramatorsk, and the smaller range towards Kramatorsk, both towards that city, and no connection to the western side. That is a highway. There are some paved roads and regular roads, countryside roads, but no highways, which limits the supply capabilities, and also the distance covered significantly increases with the additional travel time. Therefore, we see that the Russians, with the capture of Pokrovsk, would push further onwards towards these roads to push towards Kramatorsk and cut off the connection between Dnipro and Zaporizhzhia with the Donetsk region. However, cutting off the two roads here west of Pokrovsk would limit the supplies going in and out of Pokrovsk and force the Ukrainians to rely on a single supply road in and out of the city, that is with the pushing in the eastern direction towards the highway between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, which would also cut off that connection, leaving only the road in the northern direction, which is connecting on a wider angle towards the cities, and this would delay and limit the supplies being able to go in and out of Pokrovsk and operationally encircle the city. In the Kursk region, we see geolocated footage of some fighting. The Ukrainians attempting to push the Russians out of Makhnovka, where a tank was geolocated around here, trying to push the Ukrainians out of the residential area, but it was hit by a Russian FPV drone, securing the foothold the Russians have in the southern outskirts of Makhnovka as the Russians continue pushing and pressuring the Ukrainian forces to gain control over fortified positions in the southern outskirts and entering the Sucha village agglomeration here in the central parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. Now, a different topic is what is currently happening in the northern parts in the direction of Chernihiv within the Chernihiv region, which spans the border area from Bryansk in the eastern direction and into the southern regions of Belarus in the western direction. There has been some missile strikes by the Russians. At the same time, according to some Russian sources, there are reports of a potential Ukrainian offensive into the Bryansk region here in the northern direction. There has been some DRGs and reconnaissance groups pushing into the Bryansk region since the start of the Kursk incursion, and it may be possible that the Ukrainians will plan another offensive into Russian territory, this time into the Bryansk region instead of the Kursk region. This is to redirect Russian forces further and to improve the situation in the Kursk region. And this will likely come soon if it is to happen, simply to improve the situation in the Kursk region as Russians are currently ongoing with offensive operations, but also because Syrskyi himself promised a new offensive would take place and the details would be hidden. And the last time the details were hidden, the Ukrainians entered Kursk. The Ukrainian idea, I believe, is that they have a lot of forces that are on standby along the border areas which are not engaging in combat, as long as the Russians do not expand the front line and invade from another portion of the border area. And therefore they want to activate those units by expanding the front line by launching their own offensive operations, which forces the Russians to redirect forces from other sections of the front line to deal with those. However, I believe that the Russians have prepared, especially following the Kursk incursion, further defensive capabilities, including units and fortifications being built. If we take a closer look at the Bryansk region, we see that there are two main roads that we have to look at. There is the road here going from Bryansk in the east through towards Belarus in the west, and then there's the road from Bryansk in the north down towards the Kursk region through the Sumy highway directly from Kiev to the Sumy direction. It is likely that the Ukrainians would make use of that as the main route if they are to launch offensive operations. The road directly towards the Kursk region in the northern parts, the border area between Kursk and Bryansk, upwards towards the city, and the western parts through the crossing between Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. The objective would be a main push in the eastern direction, where they will gain control over the intersection here in the central parts, and then look to gain control over some choke points such as Kositsi in the northern direction. There are some river lines, forest patches, and so on, where a lot of activity could happen, similar to the Serebryanki forest area. Could even be an attempt by the Ukrainians to concentrate troops in the forest area and cross the border from that direction into Russia, or to push along the main roads and travel as fast as possible, cover as much distance as possible to really cause some panic in Russia. However, it is again unlikely that repeating the same thing twice will work. At the same time, there is this wide distance between that and Bryansk itself. It's unlikely that Bryansk itself would be the target. It could be an additional flank towards Rylsk, and pushing from the northern direction through the main road here, the main highway towards Rylsk, and then onwards towards Lvov. The main fortifications are built in a southern facing direction, and therefore the Ukrainians could benefit from flanking it from the rear. And at the same time, it would limit the Russian defensive capabilities in the eastern direction, and the Ukrainians could restart a push towards Koronevo, freeing up some of their forces who have been tired at this point from the increased pressure by Russian forces on the northern flank especially. So there are many possibilities of a new Ukrainian incursion into Russian territory, because the distance simply is very far, and that is not even considering the Belgorod region, which is also a possibility, although it is less likely than another incursion into Kursk or even the Bryansk region, simply because it is too close to the front line. The Russians would quickly be able to redirect forces if the push is too strong, either from the Kursk direction or the Luhansk, Kharkiv direction. However, if it's in the northern direction, the closest forces would be in the Kursk region, and the Ukrainians would be able to take advantage of that with the forces already within the pocket, and it is far from any of the other deployment points. However, we have to take into account that a large portion of the Russian army is still within Russian territory, which can easily be redeployed, and the Russians can also call on their CSTO allies, such as Belarus, to help them out if it becomes too difficult, or for rapid response, just a couple thousand soldiers, 1 or 2 brigades, to slow down the Ukrainian forces attempting to push into Russian territory. In case the Ukrainians attack the Bryansk region, there is the choke points, such as settlements as Sivsk, and further up settlements such as Trusnaya along the forest patches further north in the southern direction, Kositsi, there are some settlements that simply are placed at important points along the main highway, which could be areas of importance during that battle. And then in the western direction, there's Novovasylivka, as well as some other along the main highway. In either case, the only objective I can find would be to redirect further Russian forces, and for that, the forest patches are the most interesting points from which offensive operations could take place from. But again, it is a very unreasonable idea that launching another Kursk incursion or Bryansk incursion would solve the problems of the Ukrainian armed forces. The biggest problems of the Ukrainians right now is the soldiers that simply leave the front line, abandon it without firing a single shot, without fighting, like the recent story of the 155th Mechanized Brigade, where of which 5,800 soldiers are fighting within that brigade under that name, of which 1,700 have abandoned the front line, have left the front line without firing a single shot. This is a brigade of the 5,800. 2,000 were trained in France. This is one that Macron went to Ukraine to visit, checking up on them, how are they doing. This sort of brigade, which has higher expectations for it, has had 1,700 abandoning it. And this shows just a new trend among Ukraine, where entire units reportedly have decided to leave the front line because they do not enjoy the circumstances in which they fight. And the official numbers are in the tens of thousands, almost reaching 100,000. According to this AP article from November last year, over 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been charged under the desertion laws, of which 100,000 simply do not want to fight, and nearly half was in 2024 alone. This means a significant amount of troops has started deserting this year compared to last year, and I believe 2025 will continue that trend where more soldiers will simply abandon it. And that is currently, I believe, the biggest issue the Ukrainians are facing, because it doesn't matter how many fortified lines you have or how many units you have. If some of them decide to leave, it can collapse an entire front, just as we saw with how quickly the Russians captured Novovasylivka. And I believe the Battle of Pokrovsk is another example, as the Russians captured the industrial zone within just a few days, where I expected a major battle to be taking place over the industrial area. It was simply abandoned, and the footage from Pokrovsk itself shows that the city is largely intact. The Ukrainians are simply not defending their cities anymore in some areas of the front line, and if that continues at a increased pace, then that is simply something that the Ukrainians have that adds up to the unsustainability of the fighting that they're conducting in this war. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.